George White set up the Bristol Tramways Company on the 9th of August 1875, and the first trams pulled by horses at a steady 6 miles an hour started soon after. The Americans had been running trams for ages, so I guess Sir George thought that he could have a go as well. On the 9th of August 1875, Charles Challenger boarded a tram outside the King David Inn in Perry Road. You'll never guess what the King David Inn is now. And it set off for the Redland terminus at St John's Church on Aspley Road. You'll never guess what St John's Church on Aspley Road is now. This was the first horse-drawn journey in Bristol. No record, however, was made as to if it left on time or even if two of them arrived at the same time. It was a landmark event that attracted enormous crowds, and Charles was the very first conductor at the time. They tried to get Andre Previn, but he was too busy recording a TV show with Morecambe and Wise at the time.
I'm playing all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order.
As well as horse-drawn trams, there were a few horse-drawn buses, but the trams were generally faster than horse-drawn buses. Blimey, if the trams were only doing 6 miles an hour themselves, it wasn't worth getting on a bus. It was said that trams reduced general city congestion because a lot of people preferred them to buses, and trams provided affordable transport to the suburbs as well. What a pity that can't be said for today's public transport system. The tram could carry up to 16 passengers downstairs and 16 passengers on top, and their suspension system of vulcanised India rubber provided a smoother ride on Bristol's hills and potholes. Each tram was pulled by a pair of horses, more on steep routes, and speeds of up to 6 miles an hour could be achieved on the flat. Extra carrots on a stick would have given you 8 miles an hour. Not a big improvement, but pretty useful if you were running late. A Bristol Mercury reporter wrote about the remarkable form of transport.
The interior of the car is lofty, well ventilated and very commodious. The cushions and the seats were stuffed with hair and covered with luxurious velvet.
Unfortunately, these early trams were not popular with everybody. Residents of Clifton and Redland, for instance, were concerned about the prospects of hordes of lower classes coming into the area. While traders were worried about losing business to city centre shops, others felt it was a cruel way to treat the horses. On a plus side though, lots of people's roses had improved. Speaking of which, the horses were kept at the Colston stables, wedged as they were between the triangle of Perry Road, Colston Street and Griffin Lane, now Lower Park Row. This site is now occupied by the 0 Degrees pub.
You've arrived at your destination.
At its peak, the Bristol Tramway Company operated 109 trams with 678 horses across 9 city routes. That's lots and lots of very good roses. Charles Challenger worked his way up through the ranks, became general manager of the Bristol Tramways and Carriage Company Limited, and if that wasn't enough, he invented a hinged seat cover to keep the top deck seats dry in rainy weather. He called it his hinged seat cover. He also wrote a book, the Charles Challenger's Tramway Miscellany book, which included notes on horse and electric and steam tramways in Bristol, the UK and the USA. Sadly, no longer on the Amazon bestseller list, but it is still available in the Bristol archive. The changeover to electric power had nothing to do with ecology and cleanliness, or even comfort and convenience. No, it was purely that Sir George White thought he was wasting money feeding and caring for nearly 700 horses, and the electric version would be a lot cheaper. Sir George White there, obviously not a horse or rose lover. On the 14th of October 1875, the first electric trams ran from Old Market to Kingswood, and they were kept at the depot in Beaconsfield Road in St George, which also housed its own power station. The first electric journey, route number 18 for all you spotters out there, was a grand affair with good crowds lining the route. They call them bus queues these days. It was described as a party atmosphere with not a horse in sight. Seems that horses didn't like parties in those days. And before all that, our first electric trams were assembled in Bristol as well. The parts were made in Birkenhead, but they were all shipped down to Bristol, where they were assembled in the Brislington Tram Depot, which is still standing today. Got some statistics for you now, I bet you can't wait. Ready? The tram coach was mostly made of wood fixed to a metal chassis. The tram coach was 6 feet 6 inches wide and 28 feet long. They were powered by a 550 volt DC supply fed by overhead cables which delivered electricity generated by the tram company's own coal-fired power station at the Pithay Bridge. By the 1930s there were more than 200 trams operating in Bristol, serving 17 routes. They ran 364 days a year, only making a break for a cup of tea, probably Mazzawassi, at 11 AM and 3 PM daily. Oh, and a day off at Christmas. Initially, 17 tram routes existed, which were eventually reduced to 12. End of statistics. Back to the script. In 1900 to 1901, the largest depot, workshop and maintenance complex was built at Brislington, and it was used for continued construction of our trams. By 1939, the company had started to dismantle the tram network in favour of buses. However, this was put on hold during the Second World War and the trams were saved. Some trams were modified to keep them running through curfew times, the windows were blacked out and the edges were painted white. But keeping the network safe during the wartime bombing was difficult. Bus drivers were instructed to take their double-deckers home with them. You couldn't do that with a tram. For a start, there might not have been a tram line outside your house. It's true, the reason for this being that the fleet wouldn't be completely destroyed if the bus station was bombed. For trams though, the vulnerability was power, or lack of it, and the destruction of the Pithay Bridge power station during the infamous Good Friday air raid in 1941 was thanks to the Luftwaffe getting lucky. As you know, the event set most of Bristol alight at the time, and it also marked the end of trams in Bristol. Dark days indeed. The last tram from Old Market to Kingswood at the time was stranded by the Nazi-inspired power cut and was given a push by patriotic and enthusiastic passers-by as they free-wheeled it into the depot, and it was the first time the thing had ever arrived on time.
You serious?
Almost all Bristol trams were now scrapped. However, one has lovingly been preserved at Filton by Aerospace Bristol, formerly the Bristol Aero Collection. Another memorial to the system is a length of tram track still embedded in St Mary Redcliffe Churchyard, where it had landed after being blown there by a wartime bomb. 2 lengths of complete track can be seen in the car park of the Gloucester Road Medical Centre, and a short section of track still exists on the approach to the Bristol Templemeads railway station. There used to be another section of track near Castle Park, but this was lost when the area was redeveloped as part of the Cabot Circus development. Uncanny really, it survived a complete world war and then was lost when they wanted to build a big shop. So that was about it then for the good old Bristol tram. There followed a programme of intense tram destruction and removal, usually by fire. Preservation was never an option, which is why there is now only one tram left in Bristol. The march of the diesel-driven bus was relentless and inevitable. And of course these diesel-driven buses are still around to this very day apparently, if you're lucky enough and rich enough to get on one. The Bristol Tramways Company continued to operate as the main bus contractor, and the name was not changed to Bristol Omnibus Company until 1957. All changed.